Welcome to episode 32 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, a professor in the School of Architecture, where I direct the MS in Urban Design. Today's topic is what transit modes where. But as you can see, we covered a wide range of topics, actually here, a wide range of topics from climate change to gentrification to neuroscience. And they won't all fit on one single slide anymore. Keeps jumping 2 slides. All of these episodes are available on the Redesigning Cities website, our YouTube and Podomatic channels. Contact us if you'd like to be put on our mailing list. You can attend either in person or on Zoom. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Tejas Santanam and Eric Kronberg to share their work and thoughts on what transit modes where. This topic is becoming quite a heated one in Atlanta, as the long-anticipated plans for light rail on the Beltline are getting engineered, or as some worry, over-engineered, without enough discussion of alternatives. And there are a lot of alternatives. On-demand mobility, ever new forms of micro-mobility, as well as much older technologies like pedicabs and golf carts. Today's discussion asks, what kind of city, social equity, and neighborhood form do these different modes shape? How do we decide what transit modes belong where? We've got a policy expert, an urban designer, and an engineer to help us figure this out. I'm going to go down to Rebecca Serna will moderate Q&A. In addition, Rebecca is Executive Director of Propel ATL. She has a Master of Urban Policy degree from Georgia State and extensively studied participatory planning practices and innovative public transportation projects. She's received many awards and currently sits on the Stakeholder Oversight Committee for the Moving Atlanta Forward Infrastructure Initiative. Whoops. And now go back. Eric Kronberg is going to give us the urban design and land use perspective. Eric is a self-described zoning whisperer. He specializes in examining and demystifying zoning ordinances to find ways to make great projects possible and help others navigate through the zoning swamp. His award-winning design work with KUA, the Incremental Development Alliance, Congress for the New Urbanism, and Georgia Conservancy, and the National Town Builders Association has solidified his stance as an advocate for walkable and bikeable communities. Tejas Santanam just completed his BS Industrial Engineering and MS Analytics at Georgia Tech. He has experience working in research, primarily in multimodal transit optimization. He has also consulted for transit work in bus stop infrastructure, EV charging, and transit equity. Last year, Tejas was part of the team that launched the MARTA Reach service in Atlanta. And he's a research engineer at BEEP, which recently launched an AV shuttle service in the Cumberland CID. And he also serves as a lecturer at Georgia Tech School of ISYE, where he teaches constraint programming and network science courses. So with that, I'm going to welcome Tejas up to the screen, up to the podium.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out. Welcome to all of you and those of you walking in. I'm Tejas Santanam. Yes, Ellen already introduced me, but I'm a lecturer here in the Electrical Engineering Department, and I'm also a research engineer at BEEP, which some of you may have heard of BEEP, some of you may have not. But BEEP is a company that we do turnkey autonomous vehicle solutions for public transit. And even recently have launched a deployment here up in the Cumberland area near the Galleria Center and the Battery. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, I think it's something that will be quite fun. But previously when I was a student here at Georgia Tech, I did a lot of research in multimodal transit optimization and using optimization and machine learning methods to design better public transit systems, culminating in the MARTA Reach micro transit service that we ran last year in Atlanta. We've also done different consulting work with the Atlanta Department of Transportation and other organizations around the country as well. Primarily by trade, I do math, I do coding, I do these kind of things, and so I'll give you my perspective on what transit modes where, but it will also be from that kind of experience and that kind of lens for context. To start things off with our conversation and what transit modes where, we first have to look at what transit modes and then kind of break down that question. So I'll kind of go quickly through a bunch of different transit modes and kind of highlight at a high level some of their features, pros, cons. So I want to start with buses, right? These are, we see them here in MARTA runs buses. These are 10 to 12 meter long conveyances that are multi-passenger vehicles. They travel on roads, and oftentimes they can be delivered in kind of a headway or timetable-based service, often following a fixed set of stops. There are some flexible cases with demand response, so flexible route cases or skip stop type services, but for the most part, follow a set of stops. They have kind of a moderate speed that's limited by traffic, right? 20 to 35 miles per hour, kind of restricted by traffic in a city, and they don't have to go on highways and things like that. They tend to go on roads in urban and suburban areas. They have a medium fixed cost. It does cost a decent bit, a few $100,000 to get a bus. But relatively low variable cost in terms of each additional rider. If you have 2 riders versus 3 riders versus 4 riders on a bus, it doesn't cost all that much more to necessarily service each rider. There is a high hourly operating cost for each bus. For example, a MARTA bus can be anywhere from $110 to $120 per hour to operate each bus. But this can be mitigated by high ridership that could potentially make it worth it, right? There are kind of form factors that we can see where a bus can be made more efficient, and ones can be made easier through things like bus rapid transit, dedicated bus lanes, and so on. These kind of augmentations can help deliver bus service in a smoother way as well. Then I want to talk about heavy rail for a second. So MARTA runs heavy rail here in Atlanta. These are multi-car underground conveyances that can transport hundreds of passengers per train with stops roughly every 1 or 2 miles. These can go at a pretty high speed. I think the max speed for a MARTA train is like 70 miles per hour, but they don't really frequently touch that because with the having to accelerate and decelerate and so on, they can go roughly 30 to 45 miles per hour. There's considerable infrastructure costs needed to actually implement a heavy rail system. If you were to take a city that doesn't have a heavy rail system and implement one from scratch, greenfield, it's going to cost a lot of money, it's going to cost a lot of time. There's not really a variable cost for riders. Servicing 10 riders versus 20 riders versus 30 riders. This train runs, people get on, people get off. It's kind of agnostic to the number of people that ride it in terms of service cost. There's a lesser impact on land use above, right? You're running these underground. You can put pretty much whatever you want. There can be housing over, there can be restaurants and stores over it. You can put a campus like Georgia Tech over it, and so on. Then there's the concept of light rail, which is different than heavy rail, right? So this is an above-ground conveyance, multi-car, essentially trains that can transport a multi-passenger. Stops tend to be a little bit more frequent than heavy rail, maybe more of a half mile to 1 mile apart. But like buses, these are subject to traffic, right? They tend to go slower. They're kind of restricted sometimes by the flow of traffic and traffic lights and so on, maybe 20 to 30 miles per hour on average. There is considerable infrastructure cost needed to put in rails and cables and whatever it is to make these vehicles go, but these could be efficient at very high volumes of riders, again, in terms of kind of fare collection or profit from operating. That could work. And then dedicated lanes as well could make these kind of streetcars lessen the interruptions by traffic, so to speak. Then we have walking and biking, right, which is great personal level mobility. This is at your convenience. You don't need to wait for some kind of timetable or some kind of schedule to get on one of these things. You can start walking and go, whenever you want. You can also, if you have your own bike, you can hop on it and you can go wherever you have this freedom. But speed is limited, right? It doesn't cost a lot of money relatively to have a bike, but you can't necessarily go 50, 60 miles per hour on one. You're pretty limited when you're riding, bicycle and so on. You are dependent on infrastructure. Things like bike lanes are great to make biking easier, but they need to exist, right, in order to make your journey easier. There's always safety concerns and considerations. There are some streets and places here in Atlanta, for example, where I wouldn't feel safe riding a bike out of fear of getting hit by a car or what have you. And then we start to come to, out of the traditional forms of transportation into some of the newer forms of transportation. Now we're seeing some of the more technologically advanced forms of transportation, so to speak. And one is micromobility. Again, just like walking and biking, this is personal level mobility and your convenience. A lot of times there's no fixed ownership costs as providers like Lime and so on, where you can go on your phone and you can rent out one of these vehicles and go ride them. They can be faster and sometimes easier than walking to get to certain places, but again, pretty limited in speed. And they're dependent on infrastructure as well, right? You need to ride this somewhere, in some kind of lane, a sidewalk, could ride on the road, there's safety concerns. But then another concern that comes into play with micromobility is kind of the space management of it. The locations where these vehicles are always shifting, right? Geographically and also specifically, they can be blocking a wheelchair ramp or something. People could toss them into a lake, and you kind of have to deal with these different issues, right? And if they're electric, which a lot of these are, you have to make sure that they're charged and ready to go when people want to use them. In addition to micromobility, there's also the idea of microtransit, right? So these are smaller form factors, smaller than a bus, maybe half the size of a bus or so. These are vans, shuttles. You can even run a kind of service with, SUVs. People do this kind of thing. And these are, again, limited by the flow of traffic, 20 to 35 miles per hour in speed. But they're a lot more dynamic, and a lot of times it can be done at your convenience. If you've heard of on-demand transit, demand-responsive transit. You can kind of think of that in this form factor. So you can go on your phone, similar to Uber or Lyft or whatever mobility as a service provider that you use, hail one of these vehicles, and take one of these journeys on demand. It's a relatively low fixed cost to get one of these vehicles, but it's a higher variable cost, right? When you're picking up people over a large area, there's a big difference between servicing one rider, or two riders, or three riders, depending on where the demands are and where their origins and destinations are. They're harder to plan and operate, but they're flexible and lightweight in operation, and they're often used in paratransit operations as well. And then I want to talk about autonomous vehicles. So the company I work for, Beep, we work heavily with autonomous vehicles, and what we operate are autonomous shuttles. These are a shuttle form factor that go over roadways. Today, they tend to operate at a lower speed. We'll see anywhere from 10 to 30 miles per hour in general for autonomous vehicles, but year over year, these autonomous vehicles are improving and getting faster and faster. These are pretty dynamic and relatively low fixed costs as well. The cost of one of these shuttles can be comparable to the cost of a bus. And they can be used in paratransit systems as well. However, there's a huge knowledge barrier that can be difficult to understand and manage because they are pretty new, to the public transit world, and so it's not like we have years of experience to draw on. We need to play their strengths and be cognizant of their weaknesses, right? Frankly, autonomous vehicles are not perfect drivers today. They do encounter situations where they may not know exactly what to do, or they may not be at their best in certain environments, and so we have to do our best to place them in those right contexts. These can operate in mixed traffic or dedicated lanes. At Beep, we've done deployments of operating autonomous vehicles in both settings, and these vehicles are electric, right? And so they utilize EV charging infrastructure, but they're also dependent on that charging infrastructure to exist. So after the kind of highlight of some transit modes, now we kind of come to the question of what transit modes where. We have all these different transit modes, where do we place them? And I kind of want to run over a few rules of thumb at a high level. Again, each specific case is unique and different, but there are some kind of general rules that I tend to apply, certain starting points, if you will, when having a conversation about these kind of things. And it's often centered around density, not just density in terms of where people live, but also where people use these kind of services. So I think of lower density areas as areas that are very spread out. There's maybe not a lot of people in each area. There tend to be low ridership, and also a lower density of transit stops as well, right? Not just transit riders. And in these areas, it's often more difficult to provide easily accessible transit. And it can be expensive to run and build bespoke infrastructure for essentially empty fixed routes over a large area. I'm sure many of you have seen in certain parts of the city, we have MARTA buses that run close to empty through large swaths of the area. And so these kind of places tend to be more suitable for on-demand and responsive services like human-driven or autonomous shuttles, kind of like micro-transit form factor that I showed, right? And micromobility can also be used when you're close to higher density areas, things like scooters and bikes and so on, that you rent, like line and jump and whatnot. And so in these kind of places, there's a desire for lower fixed cost modes and higher variable cost modes, because you may not have a ton of riders to justify a big infrastructure spend, but you're okay with spending incrementally more amounts of money on a per trip basis and just servicing the trips as you. And as you add in that kind of transit, can lead to development and growth. Now, in higher density areas, as there are areas with a lot of stops or more riders, even airports. I know airports can sometimes, in general, in cities tend to be located in lower density parts of a metro area. But airports are a hub that do have a lot of people flowing through. And in these areas, it's often easier to provide accessible transit, right? Because there are a lot of transit stops or points of interest in all of these close together. And so you got to be careful is that you don't want to add to existing congestion, whether it's through personal cars or existing public transit conveyances. And in these places, this is more suitable for things like heavy rail that operates underground, like how MARTA does maybe here in Midtown. Bus rapid transit, right, like high frequency kind of back and forth via a small set of stops, a set of buses, and micromobility as well. And here it's kind of the opposite. You have a general desire for higher fixed cost modes because you know you're going to have a lot of ridership, a lot of use, and lower variable cost modes of transit. And here transit can improve tourism, it can improve efficiency, and so on. These are often centers where people work and live and so on and so forth. And so in general, you have these different kinds of areas and have different needs and different modes that you might tend to incorporate. How do you integrate these different areas? And so at a large scale, the way I envision it is you have on-demand transit, whether that's AV shuttles, human-driven micro-transit, micro-mobility conveyances, and you focus these as kind of feeder services to a rail, bus rapid transit-like backbone, right? Think of it like a tree trunk and branches, right? And you can't just have one or the other, right? And when you combine them, they really help bridge that first mile, last mile gap to transit, because these on-demand shuttles and AV shuttles and micromobility really help bring people into that backbone and out from the backbone to those areas, but you don't necessarily need to sink a ton of fixed route infrastructure spend into those places. So you can bridge the first mile, last mile gap that way. And in addition to that, you also want to consider, as you're bridging these different gaps, there's of course specific situations, you also want to consider things like land use, for example. Is it work, is it residential, is it entertainment, are there schools and education, what are the peak hours, and so on and so forth. This may lead you to say, hey, I want some on-demand vehicles in this part of town in the morning, and I want to shift them over here in the evening, and kind of have a dynamic set of branches around this backbone as well, right? And you also want to prioritize transit in areas with high no-car percentages, where people may not have the income to afford a car, or maybe they're relying on transit day-to-day, so you want to ensure that they really have that support. And then you also want to prioritize distribution of transit through the city. You don't want to concentrate transit all in one area. You want to make sure it's generally accessible, right? And this kind of trunk and branch system, if you will, helps make that possible. You also want to ensure connectivity between regions, right? So calculating multimodal transit isochrones and saying, hey, from where I am, using all forms of transit available to me, where can I get within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? And if there's kind of asymmetric distribution, and there's certain regions that I can't get to, how can I add transit, whether that's fixed route or whether that's on demand, what you need, to ensure that that gap is bridged. Also, this kind of system that's this hub and spoke or trunk and branch or what have you, We also want to think about when we price transit, to price these as integrated journeys rather than individual trip legs, right? You pay one price, you get access to an AV shuttle that takes you to a heavy rail stop that takes you to the airport or something like that. Not paying a price for each, but a single price for the entire journey. At a high level, these are general rules that I like to think of in cities in general. Specific cases, especially here in Atlanta or New York City, may require more analysis and really digging down into the details. But in terms of a few minutes talking to you all, it's hard to go into that level of depth. But I present this kind of system, these different modes, and so there remains the question of how, right? How do we not only elucidate specifically what modes need to go where, but how do we also understand how do we manage and actually feasibly operate such a system in a city? And as we go forward and as our city evolves towards the coming decades, right, and we strive to be the city that we want to be, not just what we are today, we have to think about the concept of smart cities, right? We equip our city with smart infrastructure and sensors and make data-powered decisions that we take this real-time information on transit vehicles and our infrastructure, and we can actually do really cool things with it, right? So we can quantify the potential impact of latent demand, right? Like maybe there isn't an on-demand AV shuttle service today, in the North Druid Hills area, but if we added one, how many people would use it? What would it cost to serve? And so on and so forth. And we can really allow for the vehicles to manipulate and respond to the environment. And so when we place and operate these many modes, you can do so from a policy perspective or from a technology perspective. And then there's a couple of different things that you can do, like combine shuttle and bike lanes, or when it comes to technology optimization-based operating algorithms, how do you ideally route and schedule these vehicles to service demand and so on. You can incrementally add different modes and create the right picture. I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to wrap things up. But thanks for listening to me talk. Happy to address any questions later. I hope you all have some great questions. And I'm going to pass it over to my friend Eric to talk more.
So Ellen said... All right, so Eric Kronberg, Urbanists Architects. We like to play in a lot of sandboxes, neighborhood development, policy, urban design, development, and a lot of housing choice and workforce housing is key areas we appreciate. We like to position ourselves as partners for inclusive places, lasting places, and vibrant places, and also attainable places, all of these things together. A couple key points to ground ourselves. 2022, Atlanta has grown to 521,300 people. Again, this floating 2050 projected population, somewhere between 1 million to 1.2 million, depending on where ARC is filling that day. But working with that, it's a population increase of about 677,000 people. 2022 actual growth, 14,300 units, residents came into the city, 11,850 housing units were delivered, right? So, but if you take 677,000 divided by the years we have left to 2050, we should be hitting 25,000 people a year. Now, these growth projections I see as growth demand projections. These are the people that would like to live here, that would come here based on the economy and things like that, not necessarily that are. If there's not housing, they're not coming in. If there's not housing, prices go up and people are forced out. So part of the question is, what is Atlanta going to do and be to accommodate the people that want to be here, right? This is both a transportation and a housing and urban design question. And so who here thinks adding at least 15,000 new cars a year to the city is a good plan, right? I don't think anybody else can support that. So we need to be talking about transit infrastructure and investment for mobility and equitable mobility options. Bad news, there's no silver bullet. That's the best clip art pick I could find, but that is a silver bullet, don't worry. And like I said, we see attainability as both a design and mobility problem. You can't separate these two, and we want to talk about them together. One of the quick things I'll run through flat out, vehicle ownership is unaffordable in Atlanta for individuals making less than 75% of AMI. I'm going to break that down a little bit. In Atlanta, the area median income, that income line that half the people in the city make less of, half people make more of, is $71,500 for one person. Right? This is the interim spectrum of AMI we like to share. It's the midpoint. When we talk about different kinds of affordability, market rate housing, this is the spectrum we use. I'm not going to dwell on it. But we like to point out our friends at AAA, we like them because they're as pro-cars we can find. They're continuing to put out that the cost of a vehicle, average cost per year, is $10,700 to $15,000 a year, right? Used car prices continue to climb. What that means is about $900 to $1,250 a month as your vehicle cost, right? That's everything, taxes, tags, insurance, gas, parking, all the stuff, right? If you make 75% of AMI, if you're making $53,000 a year in Atlanta, your rent's not supposed to be more than 30% of your cost burdened, right? That's $1,340 a month. If you're paying more than that from rent, you're housing stress. We all talk about housing stress all the time. But if you're paying more than $890 for your transportation burdened. Basically, you can't afford to own a car without being transportation burdened. What are we doing for people that can't afford to own cars? What's our mobility? What's our land use policies to make this work? Right? I like to point out, if cars are so inequitable, if they're so expensive, why are prioritizing the vast majority of our public lands to their exclusive use? Our public lands are our public right-of-way. I learned that here from Dave Green. That's our public space. We're giving them over to cars for the vast majority of our land. It's crazy. We at KUA want to maximize the potential for mixed income outcomes that prioritize car-light habitats. I'll explain why in a little bit why that matters. And so the mobility infrastructure, what can we do to equitably distribute mobility through this city? Right? A little bit of context. 1929, Atlanta boundary shown in orange. The gray is what we are today in terms of size. We always like to talk about our walkable neighborhoods where we had infrastructure that made sense. We had the trolley lines and the components. These are the neighborhoods inside our 1929 boundary. This is the 1931 streetcar map. This is a distributed transportation system. This is how the city incrementally built itself and moved its people around. This is our 1929 land use map, zoning map, and it's really amazing because we were totally a TOD as a city. All our land use was carefully calibrated to our transportation plan. Probably because the trains were built by the home builders, but that's how this worked. And so we had dense industrial and commercial uses on train lines. We had residential apartment house districts, which were both hotels and apartments by train lines. And then even our dwelling house districts still were 2 duplexes or 2 units of housing plus attached or detached ADUs. So 3 or 4 units of housing per every residential zone. We had this stuff calibrated to have housing and transportation work for everybody. What we like to point out, everything in gray is either a state highway or a federal highway. I bike most places. What I find is I can bike around a lot of Atlanta. The moment I have to go on a DOT highway, it's game over. I don't want to die. Right? These are major barriers to infrastructure that we have to fix if we're going to try to be equitable with our mobility options. This is the Beltline and our MARTA lines. We've got streetcar shown a little loop in the middle. We've got the potential streetcar extension shown up to Ponce City Market, and then a little bit up to, extending on up to Lindbergh, hopefully, as one of the second phase for the proposed streetcar. So, Tejas said, tree and branch. We really like artery and capillary. We really do think that equitable transportation is critical on the Beltline. We need a strong artery on the Beltline. We're going to talk about it in a minute. But we also have got to have land use and property tax policies to support this transit. And that's part of what we do for the capillaries around the main system to make it work and feed it. So I want to talk about transit costs, the trade-offs, and how we're going to get there. Right now, current data from ABI, publicly presented in the AJC and other sources, it's 2 miles for the streetcar extension to Ponce City Market. Current public estimates are $230 million. Pretty simple math, $115 million a mile. Right? Trying to get up to Lindbergh from Ponce City Market, which is 3 miles, that's varying in the price estimates right now, but it's between $286 million to $448 million. That's somewhere between $95 million to $150 million per mile to get up there. Right? So if the Beltline is 22 miles, you extrapolate from $95 million to $150 million per mile, we're talking $2 to $3 billion to get the train, or to get the tracks, I'm sorry. That's not the trains, it's literally just the tracks. So if we want to do this, what do we do to support this investment? Right? And also I want to point out, that's just the tracks, right? That's not right-of-way acquisition, that's not support facilities, that's not the vehicles, that's just the tracks. I'd like to point out that ABI and Beltline Rail Now are still putting out there that's going to cost $995 million as a publicly facing number, right? I think we all know that's not where we're at, right? We're at least triple. You talk about inflation, delays, we may be at $3.5 to $4 billion before this is done. Again, current transit we're looking at compared to the 1929 boundary to the full city boundary, different components here. Again, this little piece to scale, 2 miles, $115 million per mile. This next piece trying to get up to Lindbergh, that's at 286 to 448 million. Again, same numbers. one of the things we looked at when we talk about choices and support and capillary approaches, Milan's been in the press a lot. They just are deploying now a 486-mile network of protected bike lanes, right? That is that to scale as best we could of Milan, what they're doing to deploy theirs. They are doing that for $285 million. They are doing that for the low-end estimate of getting from Pont City Market to Lindbergh for 3 miles. That's the delta between light rail and protected separated bike lanes, right? They're doing this for $586,000 per mile, right? That's the difference here. If we spent that money on getting from a streetcar extension up to Lindbergh, for that same money, we could do 1,250 miles of separated protected bike lanes. Right? That's about, as best we can tell from GIS, about 71% of Atlanta's streets. Right? That's the trade-off. Now, I want to be clear, while I have a lot of concerns about the design of light rail and the Beltline, I'm watching ATL DOT try to design complete streets. I'm not sure who I'm scared for more. Who's going to do a worse job? I really don't know. So it's not a question of artery versus capillary. You need both components of the system to function, right? Otherwise, you're going to have challenges. And I think it's a simple case. I think capillaries are way more cost-effective to deploy, but we're going to need both. If we're going to add 500,000 people to the city, where are they going to go? What's the change in the land use? How are they going to get around? We're going to need rail, and we're going to need capillaries. And so what should we be doing to support the capillary, spell check, investments that are critical to support this $3 billion of artery expense? Like, assuming we have access to the capital to pay for all this, here's our to-do list. We need to significantly upzone all the land directly adjacent to the trail. We've got to be honest about it. But we also have got to be upzoning all our neighborhood lands in the Beltline overlay at a minimum. There's proposals for a new residential district called R6 that's floating out there we've been helping with. We're going to talk more about parking because this is the devil in the details. If you want people to use other modes of transportation, you've got to stop supporting parking. And while we've reduced the requirement to provide parking in our transit areas, we have got to unbundle it. I'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing we're going to talk about, we've got to have property tax caps for legacy residents. We've got to protect our seniors. Right now, we're taking funds from ABI and just handing out to seniors. We're taking Peter to pay Paul. We need better policy to protect legacy residents. And we're going to have a new funding vote for this cost, right? We need to be honest with the citizens. It's going to be $3 or $4 billion. We need to vote on that. We were promised a much lower price. We put it pennies in. Austin's getting screwed with their transportation bonds too. They totally miscalculated. And inflation's a bitch, right? There's no other way to say it. The other thing I like to say with this, we like to point out, it's a little bit older slide. If we want to be equitable, single-family only zoning near transit cannot stay. It cannot stand. Everything in pink here is everything inside the core city, the 1929 boundary in our walkable areas, within a half mile of transit or the Beltline overlay. This is land exclusively limited to single-family uses. This isn't going to work, right? If we can't change this, what are we doing? You may also notice in pink up in Buckhead land, whatever. Like, they need to stay in the city. We can do this in the core city. That's walkable, it's better there. But they've got some single-family in their transit areas as well. And a quick example of why we care about parking and equity and scale development next to rail. This is an example of the new building coming up next to Edgewood Martyr down the street from where I live. Good looking building, I think it's fine. It's great, all this housing supporting transit, rock and roll. This is the 6-story parking deck is the first thing they built, right? Right next to a heavy rail station. And if you're gonna push for large-scale development is not going to go parking free until there's transportation. And even after there's transportation, they're still not doing it, right? And the challenge is that deck, I counted, they actually didn't even do one per unit. They did about 0.9 spaces per unit. Good job, guys, for real. But that's still about $11.5 million in deck costs, right? It's about $200 in monthly cost to pay for that deck. That's with the increased cost in rent. But you know what? You're probably getting an extra 100 units if you didn't build a deck. So you're talking $300 to $350 per unit additional cost to support the parking. Studios would be at workforce housing levels if they were $350 less in this development, naturally, without subsidy, if we didn't provide the parking. So we have to have parking be unbundled, let it be paid separately from the units, let there be price transparency for residents to have a choice as to whether they want to pay to park a car or not. Right? I don't have a lot of confidence in parking maximums to actually be effective to limit this. Maybe we'll have the political will to do that. At a minimum, we should all have a choice to pay for our parking space or not. Developers will provide less parking if they know that you have to pay for it separately. There's other options for larger scale. This is, God willing, someday cul-de-sac might come to Atlanta and work at Murphy Crossing on the Beltline. These are attempts at larger scale developments that are parking light. No residential parking provided in this development as planned, but this is also a 3-story development, even on a larger scale. And we also like to point out, when we talk about these incremental situations, how do you do less parking with buildings? These are things we're doing right now for Westside Future Fund, half a space per unit. This is going to be very affordable housing. It'll be naturally workforce. There's a grant from Woodruff Foundation to reduce rents on this. So this is how, at a neighborhood scale, you can provide the workforce housing with less parking. You need the capillaries to support this, right? You need protected bike lanes. You need on-street parking. You need better sidewalks so that people can live more affordably in these communities and get to the Beltline. And so fabric-wide upzoning will impact property values. We can't pretend it won't, but so will leaving housing scarce under single-family zoning, right? When you've got that many people trying to come to your city and you're not building housing, the pricing's going to go up. There's no way around it. So we've got to find a property tax program for moderate income and legacy residents, you know, homestead exemption plus, whatever you want to call it. We need to also go back to the voters and get updated cost and plan for inflation so we can actually build this thing, right? Get the capillaries distributed, get them prepped. Let's go, but we need to vote, say yes, let's do them, spend the money if we're going to go there. Again, this is the list. We've got to really upzone and plan for this. If we want density by the trail to support rail, we've got to make it legal, right? That's what zoning does. We need the rest of the Beltline overlay and everything really around MARTA throughout the city to allow for a lot more housing options. R6 has proposed 4 units per lot with up to 10 or 12 if affordable housing is provided as part of that package. Unbundling, property taxes, and voting. So one of the questions discussed, how many years until rail could be looping the Beltline going all the way around? What are we doing in the interim to prepare for that? All right, 10 minutes, I told you.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Eric, and have a seat. All right. Thank you, Tejas and Eric. That was a whirlwind, but it was awesome amount of, I think, information. And I wanted to start with, I think, again, the devil is in the details, because you kind of both brought this up. And we're going to kind of condense the discussion part, so I'm going to jump right into the Beltline instead of putting it off and staying in the academic mode. And I know it's a heated topic. But the question of speed of a vehicle obviously makes a lot of sense. You know, the dream of the Beltline, how at Georgia Tech, we've been doing, David Green was leading studios back in the early 2000s, looking at all the potential transit stops, how to densify, you know, really seeing a lot of those land use opportunities to develop more housing and jobs that would not be reliant on cars, would be able to really rely on transit on the Beltline. At that time, the focus wasn't so much, it was an assumption of light rail, but there's a real discussion of exactly what that would look like. So what kind of concerns me is I do see, I'm all for, and I've been all in on that vision. But a lot of it does sort of depend on the design. And I think some of us have been in places where light rail is running on grass tracks, and we've been in places where it's moving slowly through downtowns, and we see in our own downtown, the streetcar moves on the streets pretty slowly, pretty fine. Yet I've seen some drawings of the 30% engineered, and they include, I wouldn't call them a full heavy fence, but concrete barriers about 2 or 3 feet high. Other people have said, oh no, it's going to be a mesh fence. Well, still, we've created this Beltline that with uses on 2 sides, are we going back to essentially turning it into, the Beltline was a railroad that divided neighborhoods because you couldn't cross it. It wasn't safe. If we're going high speed, if that's the reason for the fencing, to try to, so people won't potentially get hurt, we're suddenly making people have to walk until there's a crossing. I mean, you know, how have you seen examples in other places? How do we solve some of these design issues to really get high-density transit, high-density living and equitable access to transit, and still get all of that connectivity instead of disconnecting people with a potential mode?
I'll go first. So I'm going to reference, I'm a listener of Strong Towns and Chuck Marone, give them a shout out. There's a great podcast that came out last week with a transportation expert from Boston, and he framed it in the way that they're looking at, his firm is looking at better ways to get better outcomes for real complete streets and micromobility, all these things. He said that basically you kind of got to feed engineers what they eat. They want to know something to calculate, they want to get to an outcome, and most engineers are given this calculation to solve for speed and movement, right? And when you set this up as the criteria that you're solving for, these are the design answers you're given, right? So part of this is a leadership question. What are our priorities for transit on the Beltline? You know, connectivity, everything you're just kind of worried about, and get a really good designer, right, to address this. And there are engineering concerns, but I'm just going to channel Chuck. One of his comments is when you talk about streets, engineers are usually the worst at designing streets because they've been given a mandate to move as many cars as fast as possible. If your mandate is to move as many trains as fast as possible, you're going to make a lot of unfortunate trade-offs and decisions because that's the problem you've been asked to solve. So I think it's what's the problem we're trying to solve, have good leadership to stick by that, and then have great designers to execute.
So as the engineer, Tejas, you're handed that exactly those marching orders and sort of said, okay, in addition to making it safe, making it function fast enough that it makes sense for people to use it instead of trying to hop in a car, but also absolutely make it crossable and make it something that that is also implementable and cost and all of those other issues.
Yeah, no, I think you said the phrase fast enough, right? I think that's the key consideration is that when you look at speed, there's actually always an accessibility trade-off. Because when you're going really fast, right, you can't have an exaggeration, you can't have like a stop every 10 feet because by the time you accelerate, you're already there, right? So if you look at something like heavy rail, that's probably the fastest mode, the stops are pretty far apart. But you have something that goes a lot slower, like a bus where the stops are closer together. And so you kind of have to optimize what's fast enough such that you can actually have accessible stops along the way. And that's one dimension of accessibility. It's like linear, where are the stops? There's also, you have to think about almost like the width of it in that for each space, how do you get the most multimodal use out of the space? It's not just, hey, how many people can flow through, with necessarily maybe a train this way, because that could be a lot of people. Maybe if you add up, walking, plus scooters, plus bikes, plus autonomous shuttle, plus, this and that, and what have you, could that sum be more than, a train? I don't have the exact numbers, but it could be. But those are the kind of considerations that I personally would take into account when designing a space such as this.
And I also want to get to, I think, Eric, a lot of what you showed was sort of comparing and contrasting, like how much it's going to cost to get the light rail on the Beltline versus if we did like Milan, an amazing bike, 71% of streets to get bikes. And obviously both of you talking about sort of the capillaries and the trunk we want both. But so chicken and egg, which comes first? How do you figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, so at least for me, the way that you can do kind of, when you start the artery capillary verbiage, we have existing arteries and there's planned future arteries and so on. There's some existing capillaries and then there's room for more capillaries. The way I look at it is you have to build it up incrementally, right? So building an artery-like service, heavy rail, light rail, bus, rapid transit, what have you, requires time, requires money, a lot of planning, and it's a big infrastructure change. And there's almost that question of, in the meantime, what can you do to service that space? And a lot of time, demand responsive services or autonomous shuttles or forms of micromobility can really be that bridge to help tide you over and get you to where you need to go. And especially if we're talking about autonomous shuttles or human-driven shuttles. These are multi-passenger conveyances that, in the meantime, can effectively help to reduce cars on the road and increase the amount of available space for folks to walk, bike, and so on and so forth. And so almost to me, it's like as you build out capillaries, you create opportunities for arteries to be built, and you can kind of also get a sense of the demand and usage of the space in the meantime.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. I had like 4 going at the same time. One of the things that I was talking to friends a year ago in Durham, because Raleigh-Durham, we're trying to figure out a light rail situation, and his comment was nowhere in the Southeast really has density to support new light rail, right? Like it's just what's the density we have to do this? And so how do you build up to it, right? Because if you build the rail and try to build the building, you can't build the buildings first. You get parking decks and no people drive. Like it is this conundrum. So you have to bridge forward. And again, we continue to see scale of project makes a big difference, right? The 12 to 30 unit project, you can go low park. The 300 unit project, financing investors, it's not going to happen, right? It's really hard. But with these kinds of mobility, you can make it work. And the other thing I want to say with this is, it's not really to me about which mode of mobility here. There's like everything versus the car. It is, right? Can you have a range of mobility options that give you a choice not to have to drive your car, not to have to own a car? Because you don't care if you're taking a scooter, a bike, or a train. You just want to not have to pay $15,000 a year to own a car, right? That's the core issue. So I'm like, let's throw all of it at the wall, right? And so I think that what's interesting is this knot that no one's have cut is like, how does micromobility help us have incremental solutions until the Beltline's looping all the way with the train? If we got $4 billion to spend on it.
Yeah, I think I'm a cyclist. I would absolutely love to see the Milan plan. But there's a U.S. example that I am actually doing some work with this semester. Carmel, Indiana is a suburb of Indianapolis. They don't have transit, but years ago, the engineers came to the mayor and said, hey, Mr. Mayor, we have to start replacing our traffic lights, and it's about $250,000 per intersection. And he said, well, let's put in roundabouts. We'll never need another traffic light ever again. Well, what that also meant was you don't need a turn lane. So all their 5-lane roads became 4s, all their 3s became 2s. They've done this to 150 intersections over the course of about 12 years, and they now have 200 miles of off-road bike paths because they took that space in the right-of-way that had been for the turn lanes. So that sometimes it's even how we get there. I think there's just so many different ways of how we get there, and all of the multiples. But so this again comes down to the leadership question, because if you've got all these different things that sort of have to happen at once. Real quickly before we go to Q&A, what would be your number one? What would you first kind of establish to really get the everywhere started? What'd you say? The cab app.
The bridge line. I mean, that's it. I mean, again, it's centric to me. But again, if we can't prioritize like bike lanes on the flattest part of town with the most MARTA connectivity, like what are we doing? Really, what are we doing as a city?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, it's more of a general thing, but we just need to increase first mile, last mile connectivity to, I mean, forget, building, new infrastructure and new, rail and bus lines and things like that. What we have right now, people can get to it and make use of it efficiently. So how do we incentivize people and give them the means to even get to those stops? So I would start with providing, first mile, last mile access.
I do one more follow-up those. I think it really matters when you look at trying to get around the town, how state highways just tear up our built environment and make it really, really hard. It's hard enough to cross them with a light in places, but if you have to travel on them, so looking at, if you want to be strategic with our mobility plans, connected land at 1, 2, 5, whatever we're at, how do you help people mitigate these state highways and not have to risk their lives if they have to move along them?
Yeah. All right, I'm going to bring in Rebecca Serna to moderate Q&A. Remind you if you have questions, and I also want to say it is 1:30, so any students who have to leave or faculty to go back to studio, that's fine. Hopefully, if you can stay, many of you can stay, and folks online. I'm going to change our camera angle. Hold on. Where's we're going to 3. Okay. So, Rebecca, do you want to kick off with any questions of your own?
Sure, thank you so much. Can I ask the audience a quick question, show of hands? How many of you have ridden a MARTA bus in the last year? Okay, this is way higher than the citywide numbers, let me tell you. That puts you in a great position, I think, to understand some of this conversation about the capillaries and the branches and the arteries and whatever metaphor you choose to use. So a little bit about my perspective, because I think it's helpful to understand where your moderators are coming from. I'm a transit rider. I moved to Atlanta in the year that MARTA Rail opened, 1979. I ride the bus frequently. I've been MARTA reliant, meaning car light currently. We've been car dependent as a family with a kid, which in Atlanta is not the easiest, but I've also lived places that have bus rapid transit in Bogota, Colombia, where it's a very extensive and high capacity system, as well as places that have subways and even gondolas, Medellin, Colombia, where some of the favelas you can reach by a very innovative transit system. Highly recommend a visit if you get a chance. So to start us off today, one of the questions I wanted to go to first was related to folks with a disability. What are all of these questions about transit on the Beltline, bicycle, pedestrian access on the Beltline? Where do folks in the disability community kind of fit in, and talk about some of the impacts of the different decisions that we might make?
I'll do it quickly, Tejas. I think part of this is, MARTA mobility and paratransit, is, for first mile, last mile connection, having that kind of on-demand service just feels critical. Because if you are disabled and have challenge walking, it doesn't matter if you're a quarter mile or an eighth of a mile from the Beltline, if you can't cover that distance, it doesn't matter if there's a rail there, right? So there's all these different levels of accessibility and ability to deal with. But I think for folks that are truly mobility challenged, it's going to have to be paratransit. And I think what Tejas was talking about is there's a lot of interesting ways to expand paratransit access beyond just the current MARTA mobility program.
Yeah, absolutely. You said exactly what I was going to say, and so to add on to that, at least at the where I work, our autonomous shuttles are 100% ADA compliant, so folks that have mobility issues, that's employments in, retirement community areas where older folks are able to use the vehicles with no problem. I think kind of what ties into that is these kind of vehicles, whether autonomous or non-autonomous, if you have these kind of ADA compliant shuttles, you can run them on fixed routes, you can run them demand responsively, and that can really do a lot to solve some of these kind of accessibility concerns going forward.
And speaking of on-demand and public transit in Atlanta, there's a question about whether MARTA plans to bring back the MARTA Reach program that was piloted recently in some capacity. And I did get a response from MARTA. They are planning to bring that back as part of the Redesign bus network. And I understand the draft plan is being reviewed and public engagement should start soon. So please keep your eyes on that and be ready to weigh in. Just to stick with AVs for a minute here, Tejas, we had a question, why is safety not listed as a key concern for AVs? And how can we regulate them for safety? Should city residents have a say in permitting them on our streets?
Yeah, I think safety is absolutely a key concern for AVs. But I'll also say, like I said earlier, you have to understand and play to the strengths. And we can also understand the weaknesses of autonomous vehicles, right? And the autonomy space really is a spectrum. There's so many different ways to go about it. And a lot of what we see on the news or in the general public is we see kind of polar extremes. And we see, frankly, a lot of folks who are going about it the wrong way. And the way that I at least look at it is when an AV has an incident or gets in trouble or does something, you can't blame the AV. It's just a box on wheels, right? You have to kind of direct that blame to whoever put into that situation. So over at Beep, at least the way that we tend to go about it is we deploy these vehicles in geofence constrained operating environments, and we do so under the umbrella of public transit. It's not like we just move a fleet of vehicles into your city and go wherever and do whatever. It's we work with the city to plan where could this be successful, where is it going to not see crazy situations that it can't respond to. And so when you have those kind of considerations in mind, I think you can do so in a way that maximizes safety today, and going forward as the technology improves, it can only get safer from here. So I think there's a certain responsibility.
I want to piggyback on that. I think AV robo-taxis have created a lot of havoc and chaos in San Francisco. There's no question. AV shuttle buses that operate on a fixed track. There's over 90 of them in operation and around the world, and you don't hear about them. They're kind of boring because actually they're really safe. And in many respects, the Beltline could be that fixed track. There's not a whole lot of machine learning involved. You're just going on the same route all of the time. To me, what gets potentially really interesting, and who knows if we'll actually ever get there, but the operating cost of a bus is more than half of it goes to the driver. And under that logic, you want the biggest bus possible, and it comes maybe once an hour. If we can get to the point of truly driverless AV shuttle buses, suddenly instead of one bus coming once an hour, you can have vans, 12, 15-person vans coming every 10 minutes. That's a game changer for transit. And if the Beltline maybe was our baby track of beta testing, could that expand? I think microtransit really can work in so many parts of Atlanta that are lower density.
And I want to just say one more thing on the autonomous vehicles, because I know you mentioned driverless. I also want to emphasize that driverless does not necessarily mean without supervision, right? So at least the approach that we take at Beep is we have something called the Beep Command Center. It's a remote supervision center. We essentially have people sitting, watching camera feeds of these vehicles, keeping track of weather feeds, what have you, whatever else is needed to ensure safe operation of these vehicles, right? And so just because there isn't a driver in the shuttle, right, instead of having maybe 4 shuttles instead of 4 drivers, you can have one person who's looking at 4 camera feeds, and you have other software, to maybe bring up certain feeds from time to time if there are any issues or things like that. But there's still supervision. I think even in the long run should always be a component of these kind of systems.
Thank you. We had several questions about this chicken and egg question of how do we get the density that Eric was talking about that can support better transit while we still have a very car-dominant transportation system. And just to give a little bit of context about all these big numbers that we've been throwing around, I just wanted to mention just one Georgia Department of Transportation project that's been underway recently was about an $803 million interchange at 285 and Georgia 400. So again, $803 million, that's one highway interchange. Their budget is around $2.2 billion annually. So these are big numbers. Transportation is expensive. I was really shocked when I got into this field of work, how much things cost and how long they take. So can you speak a little bit to that kind of chicken and egg issue, and then some of the cost side of it?
Yeah, so I do think, again, scale of projects, if you legalize 12 plexes in neighborhoods, you can start to build the kind of density incrementally in communities that can leverage bike lanes, on-street parking, and other kinds of components. But I think if you think about capillaries that need to get into the Beltline to better connections and simpler there, that's a critical component of that. And then, as Tejas and Ellen are talking, the notion of, piloting an AV that does a simple loop, maybe a little bit on the Beltline and a little bit down and around. On the south side, where it's going to be another 10 or 15 years until there's rail, right? What are the ways that we can pilot and strengthen our capillaries, which therefore strengthen the muscle tissue of the built environment to be ready for the artery to be deployed, right? We have to build up the system organically and incrementally And so if we think we're going to drop in a bunch of like 500 unit apartment complexes, they'll all come with 500 space decks, right? We're not going to get there with that, but we can be building this up over time. And we need to start like 20 years ago as usual, but today.
And then what about the shifts in how people work today with the expansion of people working remotely and all of the technology that we have to support that, and then taking into account not everyone can work remotely. We have a very large hospitality industry here in Atlanta. My brother works in a bar and he lives near a MARTA station, works near a MARTA station, but he gets off work after MARTA service hours. So kind of on two ends of that, how do you think some of the changes in how people work and the land use and development patterns that follow that will affect some of these conversations?
I'll jump in on that because I think urbanists for a long time have been pretty critical of the way our transportation systems have been so focused on the commute trip. As we live and die, we spend our 800 billions, whatever, on the commute trip. And frankly, some of us feel like it's actually kind of been a sexist thing because it's the men planners are focusing on the men workers in downtown. And yet, that is only 20% at best of trips. 80% of trips, and since work from home, that number's going up, are not the commute trip. 50% of trips as of 2020, so we don't really have pandemic numbers, but 50% of trips are 3 miles or less. Those are exactly what, and I mean, an e-bike can do that in an instant. I can do it in my regular pedal bike. We have so many opportunities if we just invested in bike lanes and sidewalks, frankly, in all sorts of places. So yes, there's issues about how people work, but I think what the pandemic has really shown us is that more trips now, we have more congestion on weekends than we do during traditional rush hour. That may change. Nobody has an exact crystal ball on any of this. But really rethinking that our system should not be focused just on trying to get people from the suburbs into downtown as fast as possible. Way more jobs, way more commute trips in Atlanta are from suburb to suburb.
So Rebecca, I want to throw this question back at you. So I'm thinking about listening to Clyde Higgs, ABI's CEO, on Close Look the other day. He was talking about the need to get, one of his justifications for the rail was getting people to job centers like Ponce City Market. Assuming from like downtown and southeast or southwest. And to Ellen's point, this isn't an anti-rail comment, but I think it's all these short trips, all this connection. I question that feels like traditional thinking to me, right? That we're trying to get everybody from downtown to Ponce City Market. And it's not that people aren't going to be able to do that now with the streetcar. Where did this trip demand? Where the trip starting? Where are they going? It feels like that's a very 1970s viewpoint, but I could be wrong. Would know better than me.
Yeah, chime in, Rebecca. You can answer questions too.
Right, yeah, I'll take this one. And I think this ties in with something a lot of folks were asking about, just about the different modes that already exist on the Beltline, how they interact. So I work for Propel ATL. We used to be the Atlanta Bike Coalition, but a few years ago we expanded to add walking, so pedestrian issues, as well as transit. And I feel very strongly about this, that people are not one thing today. People use different modes of transportation to get around, especially younger generations. You don't hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm only a streetcar rider, or I'm only a walker, or something like that. People use what works best for them. And we have this plethora and abundance of different options today, so people might choose on a hour-to-hour basis how they're going to get to the next place. So I think that's all wonderful. But just thinking about kind of the traditional mindset, I do think we're still building our downtown, for example, around the car trip. So we don't have to look very far for that mindset. People have said to me, well, we have to maximize car access downtown. That is wrong. That's not how you build a great downtown. We have to maximize people access to downtown. into all of the communities and the neighborhoods that make Atlanta a really wonderful place to live, if not so much to visit. But I think that's where micromobility can come in and really help, as long as we keep in mind that part of the equation that not everyone can physically access micromobility. I think that's really essential. It's not a panacea, it's a part of the equation. I combined MARTA with biking here today, and that's something I do frequently. I think it makes transit work better to have that option, but not everyone has access to that. So how can we make sure that these on-demand options are very accessible, very convenient, and that they're implemented equitably, which doesn't mean distributed evenly. I think that's a key point to keep in mind as well. And then going back to the Q&A, a couple of folks have talked about this question. One of the commenters said the Beltline is dangerous. And then some other folks are questioning that. Where's the data on that? I think it's this sense of being a very congested space with so many different things going on that probably give rise to that feeling. And I always love the comment, Yogi Berra, any baseball fans, it's too crowded, nobody goes there anymore. That's the East Side Trail, right? So how can we taking that into account? I think what we need to do is go back to what Eric's comment was about, let's look at our street network. Our mission at Propel ATL is to transform streets into places that people can walk or bike or ride transit, and they don't have to make these decisions based on how deadly is this mode going to be. They've got multiple options that are all decent options. So if y'all could please talk a little bit about this vision side of things, not just thinking about taking this money and putting it over here, because you can't really do that, but what do we need, what is it going to take, not just the physical space, but the political side of this to transform our streets.
All right, I'm going to start with this one. And let's use Monroe Drive as an example, right? Monroe Drive near Piedmont Park has been designated for a complete street. They said they can lose a lane, they can make it safer and better and do mode options, right? So there's been political guidance to make changes. It only took one or two people to die, right, to start to get to change. Like, that's usually what it takes. But guidance was given. So getting some leadership really matters. Ideally, leadership that doesn't involve deaths, right? That's what we're trying to get to here. But then you've got to have an engineering team with priorities that are aligned for better outcomes for all users, right? This is back to the Strong Towns podcast today. Is like engineers fall into the trap of moving cars rapidly, right? They make bad decisions and bad trade-offs. And so it's both a leadership issue, but we've got leadership of like fixing some streets, and we're failing on the technical, right? I mean, that's bad engineering guidance. Right? And so that's leadership in the department, not leadership in council.
State of California changed, and the way streets are graded, not just schools. I don't know if you knew this, but streets are graded on their level of service, which is exactly quantifying how it's measuring the congestion. But the state of California kind of got rid of level of service in that way, and I know City of Decatur here has instead put in a pedestrian level of service as a way of grading streets. So a lot of times it is it's not simple, but fairly simple way to changing how you rank and grade.
Well, and again, one of the things to pick up on that, so level of service A means cars can fly and just no disruption, they can move, which is the most dangerous condition, both for cars and cyclists and pedestrians. The safest place for cars, pedestrians, and cyclists is level of service F, where everybody's moving slow as hell, right? Because speed, that is the killer, right? So slow movement is safer. There's no two ways about it, whether it's a train on the Beltline, whether it's a car, or otherwise. And so engineers can't help but grade to try to get an A, right? It's inherent in their nature, which is why we're all dying on the street.
So Tejas, do you want to like speak up for your profession here?
Oh, no, I mean, I don't think I'm that kind of engineer. To begin with, I
do you feel like it's changing? I mean, is the education of engineers, would you say that that's the old model and things are more?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily an old model that I do see change. So for example, here I work in the industrial engineering department, right? And what I do, a lot of what we deal with is optimization, right? In optimization, there's always some objective function. You're trying to, minimize cost or maximize speed or do this, and that's always been the kind of the traditional lens that we've looked at things, right? However, unfortunately, when you do try to minimize cost or maximize profit or do whatever it is, it comes at the cost of something. Often that something is, the human element, the planet, whatnot, right? And I think what we're seeing more recently in the last few years is a real push by our department heads and by ourselves as we teach our students to really focus on almost like multi-objective optimization, not just hey maximize profit, but you need to keep in mind the additional constraints of the human element of our health, of our planet's health, and so on and so forth. And so I am hopeful for change in that regard, not just how fast can we move people, but how well can we move people. Frankly, that's hard because it's not a nice, easy definition, but I'm hopeful that we can actually, get closer and closer to that in the coming years.
Speaking of optimization, there was a question about the transfers and time lost in transfers as we're looking at these different modes of transit and how they feed in with micromobility, bus rapid transit, light rail, heavy rail, the existing bus network. How do you think about that optimization of the human energy that's lost as you have to make some of these transfers?
Definitely, and transfers are a huge factor to consider, especially when you take something like a hub and spoke or train branch or whatever you want to call it, kind of transit system, because like you said, they do require energy, they take time, and you essentially need to incentivize people to believe that that kind of transfer is, for example, worth it for whatever reason. So if you look back, maybe to what we did with, Modern Reach last year, right? It was like an integrated, single payment, single trip kind of system that we wanted to envision as far as the long-term goals of that kind of program. So we wanted it to be like you paid $2.50 and you could take a shuttle and hop on a train and go to your destination or something like that, right? And if you told me I would have to make one transfer and I'll have to wait 5 minutes, but I could pay that price instead of paying, I don't know, $30 for an Uber or something, I would say, well, I could wait 5 minutes or I could spend, $28 more. Then you start to see people's minds change. So a transfer is inconvenient, but if you can make it convenient in other aspects, that's how you kind of rationalize.
Including, I have challenged my students, make waiting fun. Not just make waiting productive, make it productive, make it fun. So many of these things really are design issues of making it, so I look forward to that time at the transfer.
That's great. But I think what I think about from a human response situation is when I look at my Lyft app and you see that little car moving across the screen, that feedback is really powerful, right? It gives you a sense of control over what's happening in your life. The notion you said earlier about integrating other different modes in one system, right? And so I don't think Uber and Lyft or rideshare is effective partner to MART. I think it's cannibalization, but bike and micromobility, if there's known that if I go to the West End station and there's 5 jump bikes there that I can get because I see it and then I know that I can go and go to my thing, that level of information integration, that's how you really make the transfer feel a lot less scary because it's the unknown, right? You don't know if there's going to be a thing there or you're going to be stuck. Is it 20 minutes? But if you can see it's a 3-minute thing, that's the power to really have confidence to do what you got to do.
And even at the more basic level, do you know when the bus is coming? Is it going to come? Is there an operator? Do you know when the train is coming? So making sure some of those baseline systems work, and I've seen some improvements in that. It's been a struggle, of course, for transit agencies everywhere to keep enough operators on staff, but it seems like that's starting to improve. I think that data quality is really important, making sure you're getting good data, because the worst thing is to get out there to the bus stop, be waiting, and then the bus doesn't come.
Yeah, because I don't care how fun it is, you're not taking it a second time. Right?
No, it's really good.
It's really good. And you got the time.
It's got the best coffee. It's got the games that you want to play. There's a bus stop in Montreal that has swing sets that swing a song if you get all 28 people swinging in unison. There's great things.
So mentioned wait times and maybe waiting fun earlier. And there's one thing I want to say about wait times. So for example, when we were doing Martin Reach last year here in Atlanta, one of the things that we noticed that kind of added to the wait time was, for better or for worse, the responsiveness of the drivers, right? Like maybe they're waiting for a request to come in, a request comes in. Maybe they see it and they set it 30 seconds later, or a minute, or 2 minutes later. That adds on to the time. Or, maybe the experiences that you've ever ridden, Uber or Lyft or something, but, someone, you're driving someone and you're servicing a trip and another request comes in, right, added to the queue, and you have to wait, to accept that. That adds on to wait time. And one of the things that going forward is we can actually almost eliminate that delay with the implementation of autonomous vehicles, right? Because the autonomous vehicle, you can just dynamically, instantaneously redirect that. It doesn't, get distracted or fall asleep or anything. You can just add a trip to the queue and it'll go immediately. So you can't eliminate all waiting time, but you can eliminate, shave off a few minutes here and there and absolutely make gains towards that larger goal.
I think I'll end on this one's kind of a broader question, but someone in the audience asked, one of the main questions they hear from students with public transit is lack of perceived safety. How can this be addressed? And I want to start out with that one. I think we have a real mental block if we're thinking of public transit as less safe than driving, because driving is one of the most dangerous activities that people participate in every day. And it's almost like we can't even think about it because our systems are so built around it. I remember being on the train with my dad and my little kids at one point, and he kept admonishing me to hold their hands, they wouldn't hit their heads and get a brain injury. I'm like, Dad, they're fine, they're on a train. There's 0.001 chance of them ever getting a brain injury. You put them in the car without a seatbelt the other day. My dad, he's a lovely person, but he was raised in a different time. We had to have a serious conversation about seatbelts. So I think this perception, and going back to the perception of the Beltline, how do we address some of these perception questions?
I want to dig into this, and I don't know if somebody may speak of that question, but I think when we talk about perception of public transportation, Tejas and I talking the other day, there's the trip and there's the journey, right? And the trip is the trip on the train, but the journey is from where you're starting to where you're ending. And so is it the perception at the station, is the perception at the train, or is it the walk to and from that's really your perceived where you're potentially alone? Because usually when you're around a lot of people, you feel more safe, and probably are more safe. So when you're walking alone, particularly as a female, that last quarter mile on the street in the dark, right? And so
I'm willing to walk to the King Memorial Station now because there's some development along the way. There's eyes on the street. There's more people and more activity.
Yeah. So some of this is like, I'm just going to dog on MARTA for a minute. When they built this stuff out, the goal was you drive to a station, go work downtown, and go back and drive. There's no capillary action anywhere. There's no good connectivity in our neighborhoods to get from the stations in. That's what we're talking about, making it feel safer and more used. You need more people doing it to make it feel safer. Back to the comment, like the safest streets for cyclists are the streets everybody's cycling on, because cars are like, oh shit, it's full of cyclists, I should take a different street or slow down because there's cyclists everywhere. We need pedestrians everywhere to make it feel safer. I think people feel like unsafe in the Beltline, that's probably crazy kids on skateboards, whatever, like they're fine, but like watch out. But that's a different kind of safety concern versus getting mugged, right? Or perception of getting mugged. And that's probably not the train, it's probably not the station, it's that last part of your journey. That's the issue.
Well, I want to say, this discussion is going to be continued for sure, but just not right now. So, thank you very, very much, Rebecca, Tejas, and Eric, and thanks to all of the attendees. You've been listening to episode 32 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. A video and podcast of this event will be posted to our website. You hopefully all found that anyway. And you can also check out our previous episodes. Thank you, everybody.